In this lesson, we'll explore the rolling shutter camera option in V-Ray Next. The rolling shutter option is capable of simulating the warped motion effects primarily seen with many digital still and video cameras, giving you more options for creating stylistic motion blur in your animations. In our scene here, we already have a studio set up with a model of an industrial standing fan, which has propellers that have an animated rotation. To start, let's do a render of the scene to get a feel for it first without using any motion blur effect. Okay, now that you've seen how the fan looks without any motion, let's enable the motion blur effect. First, we need to set the rendering frame to something like the 45th frame in our animation, so the motion blur has some other frames as a reference of motion. Then, let's enable the motion blur checkbox in the render camera parameters under the depth of field and motion blur rollout. Now let's render the scene again. As you can see, we now have motion blurred propellers simulating a fan that is running. Let's enable the VFB history and save this image so that we can then use it for comparison with the rolling shutter motion blur in a moment. Okay, now to turn on the rolling shutter effect, we'll need to change the mode from disabled to one of the available directions for the shutter. For example, let's choose right to left. For now, I'll also leave the duration at 5. We'll discuss this parameter in more detail in a bit. Now let's do another render of the scene again. Keep in mind that the rolling shutter rollout is available only if the motion blur option is enabled. Now, you can see that the warped effect is visible, but we can also enhance it further by lowering the duration parameter. This parameter defines the time for the shutter to pass through the image, based on the fraction of a second value that you input. I'd also like to experiment with the direction of the shutter. Let's change it to top to bottom mode this time. I'm going to change the duration to 2 so that the shutter is now passing through the image twice every second. Generally, lower values will mean the shutter scan line passes less frequently, creating a more exaggerated warping effect. Lastly, let's increase the camera ISO to 1600 to make it more sensitive, and then change the camera shutter speed to 1/250. This way, the faster shutter speed will make the propeller blades look sharper and more defined, while the higher ISO will compensate for this and keep the image properly exposed. Okay, now let's render the scene again. As you can see, the propeller blades look more defined now due to the increased shutter speed, and the rolling shutter effect is even more visible thanks to the lower rolling shutter duration. Now let's do an A/B comparison of the first render with only the motion blur versus the new one with the added rolling shutter effect. As you can see, the rolling shutter camera option in V-Ray Next is a handy addition to your motion blur effects toolkit, giving you the ability to add interesting touches to your projects, whether for still images or even animations. For example, here you can see two animations from this scene side by side, one with only motion blur, and the other with the rolling shutter effect.